On June 14, 1381, Simon Sudbury was hiding inside the Tower of London, Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Chancellor of England, a man whose hands touched the church, the crown, the law, in the treasury. Outside, the people he had taxed were coming. They were not coming for the king. They were coming for him. The tower was not just a castle, it was the stone heart of royal power. Treasure was kept there. Enemies disappeared there. London learned fear there. From the river, it looked eternal, cold, untouchable, built so that everyone would understand. Power is here. But on that day, the idea collapsed. Village people, laborers and craftsmen entered the fortress. The same people who had spent their lives bowing to courts, landlords, collectors, and officials. Now they walked through the rooms of royal authority, opened doors they were never supposed to touch, and searched for the men they blamed for England's pain. Somewhere inside that fortress, the Archbishop of Canterbury was no longer a ruler, he was prey. This is not the story of a riot that accidentally spun out of control. It is the story of a system that believed it could squeeze England forever. Until one day England squeezed back. To understand why the tower fell, we have to begin with the dead. A generation earlier, the Black Death had moved through England. Villages emptied, fields went untilled, families vanished. The old world lost more than people. It lost certainty. Before the plague, landowners could count on labor. There were always hands for the harvest, tenants for the manor, and poor people who did what power demanded. Then so many died that the old order began to shake. For those at the bottom, horror created leverage. There were fewer workers, but the work still had to be done. A plowman could demand more money. A servant could leave for another master. A tenant could, for the first time in his life, imagine himself outside the manor. The ruling class hated that feeling. So it tried to turn time backward. Wages were frozen. Movement was restricted. Old obligations were defended. Manorial courts pressed peasants with fines, rents, and records. The message from above was brutally clear. Yes, your village is half empty. Yes, the world has changed, but your place has not. That contradiction became explosive. England after the Black Death was no longer the same country, but its rulers continued to govern it as if nothing had happened. Then came the taxes. War with France demanded money. Again and again the crown reached downward. Poll taxes were hated with particular force because they struck the person directly. Not land, not luxury, not great wealth, the living body of the subject. Even when rates varied, the logic felt insulting. The person himself had to pay simply for existing inside the kingdom. In 1381, the demand was 12 pence per person. For a poor family, that could mean weeks of hard labor surrendered to a war they had not started and a government they did not trust. The spark flared in Essex. Royal officials came to collect arrears. Local resistance hardened. People expected to bow, explain, and pay began to refuse. What followed spread very quickly. Officials were beaten. Prisons were opened. Court rolls were burned. That mattered, because those rolls were not just paper. They were proof of obligation, rent, labor service. Proof that a lord could say, "You owe me." When the rebels burned records, they were not destroying documents. They were destroying the memory of feudal power. The revolt spread quickly because the anger was already prepared. It had been gathering in fields, in courts, in tax lines, and in villages where one thought had been repeated for decades. You are needed, but you are not free. Now the thought was marching on London. Out of this rising came Wat Tyler. We know less about him than we would like. The chronicles do not give us a convenient modern biography. He appears already in motion, leading, organizing, commanding. And perhaps that is the most important thing. Wat Tyler was not a noble rebel beneath his own banner. He was a man who knew how to turn rage into direction. And rage with direction is dangerous. Beside Tyler stood another force, John Ball, a radical priest, a preacher, an ideological flame. His sermon struck at the deepest foundation of medieval society. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? When the first man dug the earth and the first woman spun thread, where were the lords? Where were the masters? Who decided that some were born to command and others to obey? John Ball gave the revolt a soul. Wat Tyler gave it movement. Together they turned suffering into a political threat. But there was one crucial nuance. The rebels did not present themselves as enemies of the king. Richard II was 14, a boy in a crown. For many, he was not the villain. He was the prisoner of villains. They believed corrupt ministers, greedy officials, and evil advisors had poisoned the kingdom around him. So they marched on London not simply to threaten the king, they marched to reach him. And that belief placed the tower itself in danger. By June 13th, the rebels had reached London. The loyal capital was supposed to become a wall between the countryside and the crown. But London was not one thing, it was unstable. Rich merchants, poor workers, apprentices, officials, foreign communities, guild rivalries. Some feared disorder, some hated royal ministers. Some looked at the approaching rebels and did not see monsters. They saw people saying aloud what many Londoners had thought for years. City gates are not opened by stone. They are opened by people. And in June 1381, London split. The rebels entered the capital and the revolt changed. It was no longer only rural rebellion. It became a crisis inside the capital itself. They destroyed the Savoy Palace, the luxurious residence of John of Gaunt, the king's uncle, and one of the most hated men in England. For the rebels, the Savoy was not just a palace. It was inequality built out of walls. They attacked legal buildings, opened prisons, burned records. Behind the destruction was a cold and frightening logic. Destroy the documents, punish the officials, break the places where power becomes permanent. Another violence also entered the city, attacks on outsiders, especially Flemish craftsmen and merchants. Social protests began to mix with hatred, rumor, and street revenge. From inside the royal world, it sounded terrifying. The streets belonged to common people, and London's central question became simple: where is the king? Richard II had a problem no wall could solve. If he refused to meet the rebels, he would look like the prisoner of hated advisors. If he met them, he would have to leave the safety of the tower. On June 14th, he rode out to Mile End, a 14-year-old king face to face with thousands of furious people from Kent, Essex, and London itself. There, Richard gave them what sounded like revolution from the mouth of the crown: freedom from serfdom, pardons, charters, promises that old obligations could be broken. For many rebels, this was the victory they had imagined. The king had heard them. The king had agreed. The king had proclaimed freedom. But the scene carried a hidden price. While Richard was at Mile End, the tower was left without the one person whose presence gave it political meaning. The king was outside, the hated ministers were inside, and the crowd knew it. This is the moment when the fortress begins to collapse. Not because the walls fall, not because the gates are smashed by rams, but because power has left the building and fear has entered it. And while the king spoke of freedom, a few miles away, people were already deciding who should die. Inside the tower were the men many rebels blamed for the kingdom's suffering: Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor; Robert Hales, Lord Treasurer and Prior of the Hospitallers in England. To a modern ear, these are only titles. To the rebels, they were faces of the state machine that had squeezed them dry. Now those men were inside the most symbolic building in England. What happened next is hard to reconstruct minute by minute. The chronicles do not give us a perfect angle, but several accounts converge on one point. Resistance almost disappeared. The gates were open. The drawbridge was down. And the central fact remains shocking. The rebels walked inside. The Tower of London was taken. The fortress built to make rebellion feel impossible suddenly could not keep rebellion out. Why did the guards not stop the crowd? Perhaps the men of the garrison were paralyzed by fear. Perhaps they did not want to kill their own countrymen for ministers many people hated. Perhaps the royal machine itself cracked in that moment. The chronicles even preserve a strange, almost humiliating detail. The rebels supposedly touched the guards' beards, as if checking whether these were real warriors, turning the defenders of the fortress into helpless extras. Imagine the sound: not a disciplined army, a crowd, voices under stone vaults, footsteps on stairs, doors opening, people who had been ruled all their lives through documents, seals, taxes, and commands now walked through the rooms where those commands were born. The tower had been built to make the person below feel small. On that day, the tower itself became small. They searched. They found Simon Sudbury. According to tradition, he was in the chapel of St. John inside the White Tower, praying. But the more important fact is this: the Archbishop of Canterbury was seized inside the royal fortress. Robert Hales was taken too. Protected men of the state became only bodies. Sudbury and Hales were dragged out to Tower Hill. And that matters. The killing did not happen in a corridor. It happened in a public place of punishment, the place where royal power usually taught London to be afraid. Now the symbolism reversed. The crowd used the geography of power against power itself. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the King's Chancellor, was killed by the people he was supposed to govern. The treasurer died with him. At Mile End, Richard was dispensing mercy. On Tower Hill, his government was bleeding. In the same hour, England seemed to split in two. One England still believed the king could settle everything with words and charters. The other had already decided that certain men had to die. That split was the strength of the revolt, and at the same time its weakness. The rebels wanted freedom, revenge against officials, the destruction of records, and a purified kingdom under the king. Each group could imagine that the others wanted exactly the same thing. But after the tower, the question changed. They had shown that they could break royal fear. Could they survive the regime's answer? The answer came the next day. June 15th, Smithfield, an open space north of the city walls, a place of markets, livestock, noise, and executions. Not the closed stone world of the tower, a public stage. Richard came again. Wat Tyler stepped forward. The rebel leader and the boy king met at the edge of catastrophe. Here the chronicles are especially biased. Writers on the side of authority make Tyler seem insolent, threatening, dangerous. Perhaps he was bold. Perhaps he was testing the king. Perhaps royal writers later darkened the scene to justify what happened. We do not know every gesture, but we know the result. A confrontation broke out. William Walworth, mayor of London, struck Wat Tyler. Others joined him. Tyler was wounded, then finished off. In one instant of violence, the revolt lost its organizer. The crowd saw its leader fall, and time seemed to stop. Thousands of people stood before the king. Many had bows, knives, axes, staves, anything a person can lift in anger. One accidental shot would have been enough. One shout, one step forward, and English history could have moved on to another path. If the rebels surged forward, Richard might die. If the king ran, monarchy would look broken. If London exploded again, the killings at the Tower would only be the beginning. But Richard did something astonishing. He rode straight toward the rebels. A 14-year-old king, face to face with the people whose leader had just been cut down. And he told them that they would have no captain but him. It was a brilliant move, and a ruthless one. For days, the rebels had insisted they were loyal to the king. Now Richard used that loyalty against the revolt itself. He occupied the empty space left by Wat Tyler's death and made himself the center of the crowd's attention. He did not defeat them by force in that moment. He defeated them with hesitation. That pause saved the regime. Then the pause ended. As soon as the immediate danger passed, royal mercy turned into revenge. The promises of Mile End were revoked. The charters were canceled. Rebels were hunted. Leaders were executed. John Ball was captured and killed. Across England, the revolt was suppressed. The boy king survived. The government survived. The old order survived, at least on paper. In the immediate sense, Wat Tyler's revolt failed. Serfdom did not disappear in 1381. A New England was not built. Legal victories evaporated. Enemies returned with ropes, courts, and executions. But history is not made only by victories that last forever. Sometimes it is made by moments rulers cannot forget. And the seizure of the Tower was exactly that kind of moment. The Tower of London was not just a defensive structure. It was a performance. Every wall said, "You will not reach us." Every locked gate said, "Power stands above you." Every prisoner inside reminded London that the royal hand could close around anyone. Then, for one day, the performance failed. People entered, ministers hid, the chancellor died, the treasurer died. The fortress built to frighten England became the stage on which England frightened its rulers. That is why June 14th, 1381 matters. The rebels did not hold the tower. Wat Tyler did not win. Richard II did not remain weak forever. But the impossible became visible. A government can punish rebels. It can cancel promises. It can rewrite the story afterward. But it cannot erase the memory of its own fear. For one day, people trained to bow entered the heart of royal power and saw that inside there were no giants, only people. People who could run, people who could hide, people who could die. The tower still stood after 1381. The walls remained, the guards returned, the doors closed again. But everyone who ruled England learned one dangerous thing. A fortress is not held by stone alone. It is held by the obedience around it. And when that obedience breaks, even the tower can fall.